Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Carrie Sawyer from the Inclusion First Project, and we are here today to do our weekly ally Q&A for anti-racism allies. And I would love to introduce my amazing guest today, Rachel Christensen of The Brink at USD. Rachel, I'm going to toss it over to you to do your official introduction, and then we will dive right into our agenda for today.
Sure. I'm just happy to be here. See, Carrie and I know each other from former lives when I guess we both had different roles, kind of connecting around social innovation and social entrepreneurship. That's what I've done for USD most of my time at University of San Diego, now at the Brink Small Business Development Center, working with companies that are scaling, usually with technology or other sort of innovations, could be scientific innovations. And so one of the things that we one of the things we feel committed to prioritizing and centering our diverse voices in sort of startup world. Much more work to be done there. And then I guess in my personal life, just, identify as a lifelong learner, with somebody that hopes to have these conversations in brave, committed ways, with lots of grace in friend and family groups. So, just something that, care about, and soon in October going to be marrying a man who is originally from Mexico. So I also have kind of those navigations in terms of, I'm a white woman from European descent, and he's Mexican American, and there's just lots of things that society puts on us. So I guess coming at this from a professional, but certainly more personal note.
That's amazing. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Very exciting. And you get the added wrinkle of marriage during COVID. So we're making history here.
Lots of pivoting all the time. Yeah. I've planned my wedding 10 times now, so it's fine.
Yeah.
It's whatever it is.
All right, awesome. Rachel, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you and to answer these questions and do this modeling. The Inclusion First Project is really all about understanding inclusion through the lens of the questions and the discourse and conversation that comes from allies in the anti-racism movement. And so we are collecting questions every week, and then we're coming here on Tuesdays to answer them. So again, thank you for being here, and keep those questions coming in. I want to thank everyone who sent a question, and also everyone who's thinking a question but maybe hasn't sent it in yet. We are actually running a campaign that we want to collect 500 questions in the month of August. So if you're thinking about a question, go ahead and send that question in to us, and you can find out how to do that at the inclusionfirstproject.org. But we're collecting questions all the time. The more, the better. All right, so what to expect tonight's flow. We're going to do just a little bit around setting the tone for the conversation today, giving some tips and frameworks that people can use as they talk about race in their own lives, peer groups, work, home, family, wherever. We're going to offer some definitions because we're talking about allyship in anti-racism. What do those words even mean? We always start off with that, and Rachel and I are going to get to have just a little conversation around kind of our take on that. And then we will jump right into the submitted questions that we got. We got a whole list. We will get to as many as we can. And of course, it's always available for you to submit a question in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will definitely take those as well. And if you are feeling like you don't want to, you can totally be anonymous in the Q&A as well. There's a way that you can go in, and where you see your name, you can use that caret to click and submit it as anonymous. So we would love to take your questions in any of those ways. And again, any questions that come up afterwards, we're curious about those too. We're doing this all through August, so you can come back. The content is always different because the questions are always different, and we're learning more and more about what people care about, what they're wondering, and we're getting better and better answers. So that's exciting for us. All right, so creating a positive space. We just want to say that this is a safe space and that really all questions are welcome. If you feel like your question might be stupid, you should already know it, it might be a little bit racist, that's all right. As long as your question comes from a place of wanting to know more and do more, positive intent, we want those questions. This is a judgment-free zone, no shame, no blame. And so one of the very first things that I like to call out is that as we're having this conversation, we're basically like modeling for you. We're showing you what it's like to have a conversation around race with someone. And Rachel and I know each other, as you heard. So how you have these conversations totally depends on that. But the first thing to keep in mind is that we are speaking for ourselves only. I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for all Black people, for all women, for all San Diegans, for all Gen Xers, just for Carrie and my experience. I'm sharing that with you. And Rachel is doing the same thing. And as you're out there in the world, just remembering to connect with people as individuals, drop all the stereotypes, drop all the assumptions, and assume that they are speaking for themselves and they're not speaking representing their entire race. The second thing that I love to point out is that we don't know everything. I don't know everything about being Black or everything about being a woman, every like part in history, every experience that there has been. No, I only know about my own experience. And so you might ask a question that stumps us, but that's okay because we're all on this learning journey together. And it's not our job to know everything. It's our job to keep learning. And we will do our best to find an answer if we don't have it. This is a lifelong journey, and everyone is at a different point as we're thinking about allyship. It's not like a one and done, oh, I went to a protest, oh, I donated, oh, I said something, on social media, I'm an ally. We're going to talk a little bit more about what allyship means, but this is something that we're doing. We're waking up every day and we're looking for opportunities in our life to be an ally, to combat racism, and honestly, all of the other isms as well. And everyone is at a different point, comfort level, education-wise, knowledge on this journey, and that is okay. Again, it's just important that we are on this journey and that we are moving in the direction of anti-racism. And because we're all at different points with different experiences, your role in driving change will be unique. You are uniquely situated with where you are in your family, the job that you do, your peer group, your circle of friends. That's where we really start this work, right? Like right where we are. And it's going to be different based on where you are. You're going to have different access, different influencers, different ways to contribute. And again, it's going to look very different. And our job is really to figure out what does that look like and how can I be of biggest impact in this circle that I'm in. And then because of that, again, the process is different. So these are just some things to keep in mind as we're, we like to compare ourselves, right, Rachel, like to what someone else is doing. And in this, it's a very unique and very specific. And that's kind of what I want people to expect. And we're, becoming investigators on what that actually looks like and finding that for ourselves as we journey towards to and through anti-racism, if that makes sense.
Great.
Okay. So, Rachel, I'm going to start off just by going through some definitions, and then I would love to get your take on this and expanding this as well. So this first definition of anti-racist. So this is from Dr. Kendi's work, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Anti-racist is someone who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing anti-racist ideas. This includes the expression or idea that racial groups are equal and do not need developing, and supporting policies that reduce racial inequity. So that's like a very official sounding definition of what an anti-racist is. And that's like the person, but it basically means like you're an anti-racist. And so it's an active stance. It's an active thing that we're doing here. And we're expressing anti-racist ideas, which I have a slide for that as well. But it's just the idea that everyone is actually equal. Like there's no racial group that is superior or better or anything like that. And reason, of course that makes sense to a lot of us, especially people who would sign up for an anti-racism weekly Q&A, but that actually comes historically, some of the propaganda and fake science that was put out in the days of slavery was that, African-American people were physiologically, mentally, socially, everything just beneath. We weren't developed. We were uncivilized. We were closer to animals than we were to white people. And so that's why this idea of anti-racist has this, this specific calling out of all racial groups are equal. So Rachel, anything to add on that? Yeah, anything?
My gut was to say painful history, and then I was like, no, painful present. Just painful,
Yeah.
painful to always acknowledge and work through all of that. Mm-hmm. But I think that the work that does not need developing piece is so helpful to remember. A lot of they're much more than microaggressions, but a lot of the things that people say that are racist that they don't realize that are racist, so things that I'm thinking about in my own family, really imply that there's people that people are in groups that need developing in some area, or that there's some hierarchy where some races were gifted some physical, strength, while others were gifted, business acumen. So all of those kind of really, really dangerous and deadly, really. Beliefs are so pervasive.
No, absolutely. Yep. And I think that, as we're thinking about just the examples and thinking back to conversations, I think that's a great a great space to be in as we're thinking about anti-racism and how it shows up and how racism shows up in our world, from like the small comments to just larger sweeping stereotypes, right? So anti-racism, that is like the work that we're doing here, the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. And I love this because this is basically everything, like politics, how our country is governed, all of the systems and structures, economic, how money is distributed throughout our country, how people have access or don't have access, how money moves around, and then social life, which basically encompasses everything else, like your social life, your friends, your family, places of faith or worship, where you work, like it's everything. And so anti-racism is opposing racism wherever we see it. And that's in a lot of different spaces. It's in, you know, when we start to dig into what racism looks like, we start to see that it's in all systems. And so again, just this idea, anti-racist ideas, when people are talking about this in an academic way, especially, you'll hear the idea of anti-racist ideas. And again, it's just that same idea that all racial groups are equal, and there's nothing wrong with any racial group. And there's this quote that I really love from Ijoma Aluo. She's the author of Let's Talk About Race. And so anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it is the only way forward. And I love this because we are in a racist society and we are socialized in a way that basically makes all of us susceptible to racism. And so this idea of finding it, whether it's external, but also there's a lot of inner work and a lot of inner examination that happens in the work of anti-racism. And I think that this quote beautifully captures that. Okay. Rachel, do you want to talk a little bit about allyship for us?
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, because like as a hashtag and as a shortcut for understanding, like it's undergone a transformation on social media of late too, right? So allyship, and then advocacy has a similar but different word, and then a conspirator, and you know, there's like a lot of terms that people will use now. But essentially, yeah, I think that this definition that pulls out this idea that it's something that's active and intentional, that it's a practice that's ongoing, that it's unlearning, that there's no such thing really as a person who exists in society that hasn't been socialized within racist systems, and that applies to people of color and white people, right? And so that we've all been socialized into a way that unlearning is necessary for all of us, and that we all have biases, and we all have unconscious behaviors that are really really working against our anti-racist causes. And that there's a piece here of that it's you know, that you acknowledge your positionality and privilege, and then there's a piece that there's solidarity with a group, and that you realize that our hopefully that our futures are bound up together, and that, you know, I guess if you're to add anything, a lot of the conversation, even right now with Black Lives Matter protests, certainly would be, how do you center the voices of the leaders of that particular racial group, for example, and not talk over or co-opt or sort of make it about virtue signaling, but instead true solidarity, which is for the long haul. Right. And not so that you can just sort of cover your butt and say that you were there. Although again, as you said, it's like an appreciation of the spectrum and the journey. It's not like trying to say there's one right way to be an anti-racist. It is just more of an appreciation of the journey and the unlearning that literally is the work for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I love, you know, just re-emphasizing what you said around the, you know, this active nature. And it's the same with anti-racism and allyship. They're both an active thing. They're both verbs. And so, you know, we're constantly learning and relearning how to be good allies. And so I pulled out this little cartoon, and I love cartoons generally, but I like cartoons in that it just helps to make things simple. And so this one specifically around like how to be an ally in training, and this idea that you're not like, you don't just get an ally stamp. One day we can always be allies in training, because things are always changing. We're always learning. We're having new experiences, new interactions. And so it just, again, underlines that activity and this idea that we're constantly learning. And so these 4 different tenets. So understanding your privilege. And we have got a couple of questions about privilege and white privilege. So we'll definitely be talking about that, and knowing how to use that for good. Listening, and not just listening like, we aren't good listeners in our country generally, right? We're listening to respond to someone. We're listening to agree or disagree. We're not rarely listening to understand. And in this forum of anti-racism, as we're trying to connect with people, we have to listen to understand and ask questions and set aside our triggers and really dig into what the other person is saying. And so there's a lot of this in allyship. Rachel mentioned the kind of speak up, not over. So how are we amplifying voices? How are you using your privilege, your platform, to amplify causes, amplify voices, versus, thinking that you know everything and talking over people and not working in solidarity, not collaborating, but kind of going your own way. And then number 4 is really, I feel like, one of the most important ones. We talked a little bit about how we don't know everything. This is very akin to that. So mistakes happen. We don't know everything, so mistakes happen. And that's okay. And it's part of the work. And when you mess up, what you do is pick yourself back up, apologize, and then learn more and do better next time. And it really is about, making the mistake and standing back up with integrity. Don't go hide in the stand. Don't go, don't cease everything that you were doing because it was so uncomfortable or painful to make that mistake. Brush yourself off and continue the journey, continue the fight. So I just love talking about this, like just this little cartoon and these little tenets, because it's just really simple. Rachel, anything to add from this?
No, I think it's just like something to post on our walls.
Yes. Yes, I agree. And, we're talking about anti-racism, but this is ally. There's so many different kinds of allies, right? There's allies in basically all of the isms that are out there. And so this isn't just applying to, where we are right now. It's applying to anytime we're in these conversations or anytime that we are speaking about basically oppression. Absolutely, Grace. You can screenshot this and share it with on your socials. And I will, I'll send this out also after. Good question. Okay. That's it for the slides. That's it for the definitions. If anyone has questions or wants any other clarifications on allyship, on anti-racism, please feel free to throw that in the chat and we will definitely circle back to it. And just so you know, today and in all of our anti-racism for Ally weekly meetings, we are just scratching the surface. We're really just trying to get people to think in a different way, give them a little more information than they have, and then send them back off into the world, because you could absolutely talk about any of these topics. There's courses on, allyship. There's courses on anti-race. There's, degrees. So there's a lot of content. And we are just here to get everyone thinking and get those juices flowing so you can take that back into the world. I just saw there's a question in the Q&A. Sorry, that makes me really excited because I want all the questions. Okay, so can we talk about some of the criticism of the term ally with regards to racism? Yes, and Rachel, you started to get at some of that with some of the different words that you were using. You want to take a stab at that one first?
Goodness. Well, I guess some of the criticism, I'll just the categories or the buckets of criticism. I think the criticism, or just the discontent with the terms we've been using for a while, is how intentional or active it is versus passive, and then how much people are willing, I guess similarly, how much people are willing to relinquish their privilege so that there's enough of whatever the thing is, whatever the resource is, to go around, because of poor distribution of opportunity and things and et cetera. So I think it has to do with mostly around active versus passive.
Absolutely. Yep, the active versus passive. There's I love this question because some of the criticism, there's even a word for it now, performative allyship. You're just doing it to get your stamp. You're, flipping your Facebook to black and calling it a day. And say that you're doing it really, I don't want to say for the wrong reason, but it's for the wrong reason. You're doing it so that externally you can look like you're an ally, but you're actually not really doing a lot more than lip service. And then there's also this idea of, Rachel, you mentioned the words advocate and champion. I've heard conspirator. A lot of people who are talking about allies are I don't want an ally, I want a conspirator, because conspirator is someone who really is going to work beside you in a way that an ally is just hi, I'm an ally. You can say you're an ally without actually having to do anything. But this idea of conspirator, co-conspirator, collaborator, is like a totally different thing, right? We want people who are going to get in the mud, get their hands dirty, put their social capital, but their privilege and power on the line as well, right? And not kind of take this sideline glance. And last week, we talked a lot about allyship because there's this article that says there's no such thing as a white ally, and this idea that white people can't be allies because white people perpetuate racism, and how can you be an ally in something that you are perpetuating? It was a very, very complex and very deep article. I definitely recommend reading it, but I mean, that's just another take on this, right? So I think that to your earlier points, Rachel, that like the allyship can be a very passive, a very like stamp thing. And that's why people are like, I don't want allies. I want co-conspirators. I want advocates. I want people who are going to stand with me in solidarity in a real way, not in a performative way or a, like, I just did this to look good kind of way.
Totally. And not just when it's convenient. So not even just when it's kind of like politically helpful to do so on social media, for example, but also not just when it's convenient. I think
right. Like who's still talking about this on their social media, right? Versus everyone was talking about it. I've had a few people just bring up to me, like in the last week, my partner's daughter, who's 22, a friend of mine who's 35. They were like, you know, there was so much, it was trending. Black Lives Matter, all of these things were trending, and now it's like a ghost town, right? Who's still talking about it? And I believe people are still talking about it. People are still doing the work. It's just less on social media. So how do we, again, like allies are doing the work. They're not going back into the shadows like, oh, I guess no one cares about it anymore. I guess I'm going to take that stance too. So yes. Okay, cool. We are definitely going to get to the question that is around racist behaviors. And then I just wanted to read one of the comments, but just a yay for the announcement of Senator Kamala Harris as the VP pick. So yes, thank you. Thank you for that. That's awesome. That made me happy too. Okay, so let's get into the first questions that we have. And then we'll pop into the Q&A again as well and grab something out of there. So Rachel, I'm going to read you this question and let you go on it, or you can send it back to me. We're just going to kind of go free flowing on this. So we had two questions that are actually very similar that came in this week. And so the first one is, can we say use the word Black when referring to African Americans? What about others with African heritage who aren't American? Then the other one is, when do you refer to someone as Black and when do you refer to someone as African American? I'm learning that the difference has to do with someone's ancestors, but how do you know? Ask without being offensive. What do you think?
Well, I would be curious. I'm much more curious about your answer there.
Oh yeah.
Because it's a question I ask a lot, but I think some of it is like, you know, definitely the answer on a personal level, I think is, you know, with grace, you can usually ask somebody what they prefer if it matters to ask them how you should refer to them. Often, like, I could be friends with somebody for many years and not have to know how they prefer to be called necessarily, unless, you know, I don't know, I guess in a conversation, but it wouldn't always come up sometimes with friends because we talk about things in other ways, I suppose. But I think also in professional environments, like you know, we at the Brink, we work with a lot of government contracts. And so like some of it just has to do with like census rules, which are problematic in so many ways, like the ways that people are sort of forced to identify within buckets that are sort of not just antiquated, but like not helpful for people's multiple layers of identity. So there's one answer, which is just like, how do we, I guess I'm just bringing to this conversation because I would be curious on a personal level what you think, Carrie, but like how do resources get allocated, particularly public resources? Like it's a really important question how people answer for census and other demographic inquiries so that resources get allocated well and that we can track when public resources particularly are flowing to disproportionately to certain groups. So, wow, what an important question.
Yeah, I actually never thought of that part of it. For sure. I definitely think about it kind of on the personal level. And I think you're totally right. Your answer is similar to mine in that if it comes up, like you can definitely ask. And this has a lot to do with relationships too, because we like we don't talk about race in this country. And that's something that this particular forum is trying to turn on its head. But if you think about, people say, don't talk about religion, don't talk about politics. Like we don't talk about race so much, we can't even say that we're not supposed to talk about it. You just can't mention it, right? So, but when you know someone and when you have a friend or a peer or a colleague, then there's a little bit more grace in that relationship. But potentially, if appropriate, you could ask them, you know, how do you prefer to identify? Because the answer to this question is totally, it depends. Like I have friends who don't want to be called Black because they feel that it takes the African out of their ancestry and out of their identity. They want to be known as African American under all circumstances. I also have friends who don't want to be called Black. Don't want to be called African American. They want to be called Black. Me personally, I don't really care one way or the other. So it just totally depends on the person, and people might have strong reasons for why they want to be called one thing or another, which is why I think always the best way to do is to not assume and just ask. And even if you're unsure about asking, be like, hey, you know what, you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to, or if it's like a weird question, but I was just wondering, right? And you can even tell them why you're wondering, like, you know, it's just, you know, and if they're like, that's none of your business, then that's fine. That also doesn't mean that every person is going to react in that same way, or they might just tell you. So, you know, that's one thing. As we're navigating these conversations on race, people are at different points in their day and their level of frustration. Because you get shut down from one person doesn't mean that you're going to get shut down from every person. So I'm not even saying that, you know, you're going to necessarily get shut down, but people, you know, we're just in different moods, especially right now, and depending upon what's going on in the news and how we're processing that personally. But you have people that you're close to in your life, just ask them and let them know why you're asking. And, you know, as a friend, I just wanted to know, right? So I think that that's perfectly fine. Awesome. Okay, Rachel, do you want to, I'm going to read maybe the second one. And I feel like it also kind of goes in with this one that we have in the Q&A. So let me just read this one really quick. Okay, so this one, how do you confront people, family members who claim they're allies, yet still say racist things or seem to only be able to describe non-Caucasian people by the color of their skin? And then we have one in the Q&A that's also similar. How do you address racist behavior without making someone defensive so that they are open to learning rather than feeling like they need to defend their behaviors because they're not racist? And so this idea that like people are identifying as not being a racist, but then you're observing them doing or saying racist things. And how do you interrupt that in a way that is going to lead to a productive conversation versus everyone getting defensive and shutting down? I think that's kind of the summary between the two questions. Rachel, what do you think about that?
I think it's so hard and so like, you know, immediately pertinent to my life. So I guess context matters first. And that's something like I just had a recent, I don't know if I'd call it family vacation because COVID makes everything hard, but like I just recently, we drove out to see my grandma from a distance in Idaho. And so it's just like, you know, there are things that come up. And so, you know, it's just like, it's not even, how do I say this? People are going to come at whatever is going on that has a political element, political meaning, like how resources are distributed or who's getting the most attention or whatever. So now, even though I don't think Black Lives Matters is, you know, partisan, right? But there is like it shouldn't be, but there is a political element to it because people feel like who's getting, like whose voices are loudest or whatever. So anyway, the point is like within families, and most recently in my own family, there can be things that come up and you're like, oh my goodness. And I use a very specific example of Black Lives Matters, but that could be for anything. And it certainly happens. Again, I'm you know, have dated for the last couple of years a person of color who I'm marrying. So things come up naturally. So anyway, context matters. So what I'm trying to say, which is like, if you're like the mood is light and everybody's having fun, you have an obligation, I think, to interrupt the racism and call it out. And also you're going to sometimes not want to because the mood is light and you're having fun and you don't want to change the mood. And also you're going to, you know, miss the opportunity sometimes. And also you have to figure out how willing is the person to have a conversation. So, I mean, the easiest way to try to get somebody off the defensive is to remind them that you're not like criticizing their traits as a good person as much as you're saying, wow, we're all participating in a racist system that socialized us to think this, and we can't think that way. Like we have to transform our thinking and unlearn. And so it makes it less about them and more about like all the collective learning, and it like is more of a posture of humility. and yet interrupts the dangerous and deadly belief that, sometimes deadly belief that could be coming out of their mouths or their actions. So I think that those are a couple of thoughts, but then like, I just think sometimes it's just the long haul, particularly with family members, that there's not always an opening to talk about it. And so you can interrupt it, but then maybe how long of the conversation, how open are they to have the conversation? How curious are they? Really depends how far you can go without it becoming an argument or people just shutting down.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's another one of those, like, it depends, because there are some people that no matter what you say, you're never going to change their mind. At least that's what it feels like on the outside. And so really, how can you set yourself up for success when you decide to broach this topic? And sometimes it's just in the moment, right? And so you have an opportunity to do it right then, or maybe you have an opportunity to circle back to it at another time, maybe in a less like public format, or maybe just with that person. You kind of have to feel out what that looks like. But if you're able to like set up a time for these conversations to happen, how can you make sure that you're in a good place mentally, they're in a good place mentally, like no one is cranky, no one is hungry, no one is stressed, and just like have this kind of open conversation and really think about, what are your goals? Like, are you there to change their mind? Are you there to make them understand? Are you there to get your point across? Or are you there to like listen and learn a little bit more about their perspective? Because when we are talked at, and when someone tells us that what we were thinking is wrong, it's like human, no matter what the topic, right? To just go on the defensive and kind of shut down. And so how can you kind of like trick them a little bit by digging in to like what it is that they're expressing? Like, grandma, I mean, I'm not saying get into it with your grandma, because we all give grandmas and grandpas like way passes, but uncle, cousin, brother, friend, whoever, you said this, and I just want to understand a little bit more about what you think about that. Like, talk to me about why, and just dig into that whole thing, and remembering to listen, to understand. And so becoming curious, asking why, and really understanding their perspective. And you're going to be triggered while this is happening, but what you're doing is learning about them, so that as you are framing like your argument, or thinking about how you might bring points or examples, even in a later conversation, you understand like where they're coming from, and you maybe have the opportunity to help them to think about things in a different way and kind of guide them through that conversation. And, with some people that will totally work. Other people, it won't work at all, right? I'll totally acknowledge that. In other circumstances, it'll work with some people some of the time. So it's this like hit or miss thing, but that is why like this work isn't just like a one and done. And you never really know how far you actually got with someone. You could have a conversation around race or what people should or shouldn't say or should or shouldn't do, and feel like it was just like throwing like bricks up against a wall, like they didn't get through it all. But actually, maybe they did think about something differently. We've given this example before, but I have a friend who used to work with a nonprofit that helped women get out of sex trafficking. And she told us that it took 70 touches, 70 interactions with this woman in order to pull her out and get her to a place of safety where they could then put her within the wraparound services. 70. And so what she was explaining to us is that you never know like what interaction you're on, like what point. You could be on like the first interaction, you could be on the 67th interaction, you could be on that interaction that is just about to get that person to like think about something in a different way, even if only very, very slightly, right? And we can't actually see into them. And so just if the relationship is important to you, like just keep at it, keep learning about them, keep trying to express yourself, give examples, and just keep that conversation going, because you never know how far you're getting with someone.
Good point. So patience and grace, and not shaming somebody will do a lot to get them on the defensive. And something that I talk a lot about with friends is just like trying that curiosity to understand, and like you'll at some point get a kernel of understanding about what it is that this person is feeling so sort of challenged by, or on edge about, or worried about. Like usually there's like a grain of fear of loss of something, or a fear of being left out of a conversation, or there's usually some motivator there, and that often can bring a little bit of empathy from our part into how they're like, why they're feeling that way, even though if we don't agree with the belief system at all. Like you're like, okay, it's like this is motivated by a very primal human thing.
Yeah, Absolutely. And I think some other ways, like there's all these interesting little cartoons or articles or tidbits. If you know you have someone who would be open to it, like, hey, family, let's like read this article or let's watch this cartoon, or hey, did you see this commentary, this tweet? Like, what do you think about that? And just kind of opening up some of these discussions just to, again, understand different points of view, to see how they're interpreting what they're seeing, to see maybe they're pointing back to like some fake news or something that's not actually true, where you can help to insert something that actually is a reputable source, right? So just thinking about that, I feel like I was watching Dr. Kendi, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, How to Be a Racist. That's the worst book ever. How to Be an Anti-Racist. He did a webinar a couple weeks ago. There was literally like 80,000 people on YouTube trying to watch his webinar, but he was like, start a book club, and like the 5th or 6th book in, like put one about like racism in there, and so that you can again like just ease people into it was more of was more of his advice. But there's different ways, and just understanding the person that you're talking with and what they might respond the best to. So getting creative, and then also being persistent, having that patience, like Rachel said. Okay, great. The question that was in the Q&A, if you have any follow-ups to kind of what we talked about, feel free to like throw another question in there, and we'll continue to dissect that. So okay, the next question that we wanted to talk about. So how can I check in with my friends of color but not burden them to explain anything or make assumptions about how they are feeling? And another question that was very similar, how do I demonstrate to my Black friends and colleagues that I support them without making them feel pressured to talk about racism? I want to express that I stand in solidarity with them, but don't want to make them feel uncomfortable or feel like they have to talk about racism with yet another white person. And I love and appreciate this question because I feel like someone on the news, this was like shortly after George Floyd was murdered, someone on the news or on social media said, hey, check in on your Black friends because they're not okay. And that created a slew of somewhat performative allyship, honestly, of text message and calls that Black people got, including myself, because people were like, hey, are you okay? We haven't talked for like 6 months. There's a pandemic. You didn't check to see if I was well. Why are you like checking it out? Because someone on social media said, check in on your Black friends. And am I the only person that you know that, even though we haven't talked in 8 months, like you thought to text me? I appreciate like the sentiment, but there was like, obviously, like I felt like it was a little bit insincere. And so just this idea of being there as a resource, as an ally, as a support system for your friends of color, or, you know, I mean, this isn't just for people of color, obviously, right? Other groups are marginalized as well, but in a way that you're not asking anything from them. I appreciated the text messages the most that came from people who I talk to on a regular basis, and also were just like, hey, I'm thinking about you. I hope that you're okay. If you want to talk or if you need anything, let me know. Right? They're not asking anything from me. I also got calls from people that were like, oh my gosh, it's so terrible. I feel so bad. I feel so guilty. And then they totally flipped it. They called to check on me, but then I'm counseling them on how they feel about what's going on. Right? So that's a huge, like, it happened so many times. I was just like, I'm not answering the phone because I was tricked. I'm like, oh, my friend is calling me. That's awesome. I haven't heard from her. And then it turns into this whole other thing. Right? And so there was a big ask from her for me to like carry her emotional burden when I'm also suffering too. Right? And so being there in a way that doesn't ask anything of the person, I feel like is really great. And this also has to do with like the relationship that you have with someone. Like you don't need to go and check on someone that you don't have a strong relationship with, and at a peer level. Now at work, if you're a leader, you absolutely, again, should like have this open door policy. Like we know a lot is going on. If you need to talk, we're here, or here's resources or what have you. You have different responsibilities and levels of familiarity in a work setting. But at the personal level, just being there without asking anything in return, without asking them to carry your emotional burden as well as their own, is much appreciated, at least from my experience. Rachel, I don't know if you observed or how you navigated that, like your friends of color, like how did you navigate?
Well, I talked about it a lot. So like there's a particular friend that we probably hadn't talked to for about, I don't know, maybe 3 months or so. And Raul and I talked about it a lot. So Raul being my fiance, and just like, oh, like we want to text him, but then like, I don't want him to feel like I'm just texting him for this reason, and like kind of like overthinking it big time. But like also like, I don't know. So we ended up just saying like, hey, we're thinking of you. Like, do you want to like go on a distance walk anytime, like let us know. And then also like we're going, you know, we walked alongside a couple of the Black Lives Matter protests where we sort of felt like it was going to be safe and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I don't need to go with all these just disclaimers, but it's a weird world to navigate all this stuff. So those were like some things. And so like I did probably text about 5 friends, and I tried to make sure like number one rule, like do it out of relationship, not because it's about, you know, not to feel better. And 2, don't make it about me. Like don't ask them to, you know, carry the burden, and don't make it like so that I get any checks or whatever. But so mixed results, like out of those 5 friends I probably did reach out to, like there is like, you know, somebody kind of confused by the text, because it had been, you know, a couple months or something. So I probably like fell into that category. And then another friend that was like, hey, like me and my sister, you know, both of them African-American from Ghana actually, and living here, and said like, actually, we don't have anybody to kind of go march with, and, you know, would you go with us? You know, could we go together? And so like something pretty beautiful came out of that exchange. So totally mixed responses, but like, I guess the point at the end of the day was like, did I reach out in a relationship, and did I not make it about me? Because in this case, it's about my unlearning, but it's not about my my emotional needs to feel good about myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's, yeah, it is. It's challenging to navigate. And even, you know, the person who didn't respond, like, honestly, we've all been on an emotional roller coaster just for so long that you catch me on one day and I'm like, yeah, great, let's chat. And the next day I'm like, go away, leave me alone. Right. And so, but it's nothing to do with you. It has to do with me and how I'm processing. And so I totally love, you know, just what you were sharing, like not taking it personally. And that person knows that you're there. And if they wanted to talk, they can. If they don't, that's fine. And there's really no judgment, no shame, no blame where you are. And just one more thing I want to point out around this particular question is that when you're asking African-American or people of color or oppressed people, marginalized people to share their experience with you, it just has to be done in a delicate way, because ultimately, like, these are traumas from people who have been beaten up by the police themselves, to people who know family members who have been harassed, to the fact that we're all, you know, navigating microaggressions of, you know, large to small. Like these are mini and major traumas. And so you wouldn't ask someone to relive a trauma for you for your learning. And I know that that's not the intent of some of the questions that come out in the conversations, but just being really aware and letting people know that it's totally okay. Like, hey, I have some questions, and I would love to talk with you about it if you're open to it. And the other thing is that when you come with your questions, like, don't come with an empty cup. Like, go get on Google, like, do some research, think about what you're actually wanting to talk about, and go find out, do some learning on your own, so that when you come, you're like, hey, you know what, I've been doing research and I've been having conversations and I have some questions and I would love to just get your perspective on it. Because a lot of times people will come to, from my own experience, people have come to me with like just an empty cup, like, can you tell me about this? And I'm like, but what about Google? Like, why are you just asking me about that? Right. And they're not necessarily even asking about my experience. They want me to teach them. And that also, again, carrying the burden, right? So carry your part of the burden, educate yourself, do some research, do some thinking, and come with, like, you know, a partially, like, you know, filled cup. Here's some ideas that I have, and I just want to have a conversation when you're ready, if you're open to it. And some people will say, no, they don't want to do that work. And that is totally fine, because it's not our job. And you're always in the mood, but then those aren't your people to discuss this with. There's someone else who's like, hey, yeah, I'm in a good place right now, and I'd love to talk with you more about this, right? So don't get discouraged, because the person who doesn't want to talk to you about it, it's really not about you at all. It's about them and their processing and what they're going through, and how they're feeling at that moment. And you could have caught them on a different day and gotten a completely different response, I feel like, for some people like me anyways. So, yeah. Awesome. I want to take this. There's another comment around Kamala Harris that is around race in the Q&A, and I wanted to read this to everyone. So I read this today in regards to Senator Harris. She was referred to as being part Asian American since her mother is Indian, not Native American. However, she's not Native American. Sorry, I read that weird because of the parentheses. However, some commenters on Facebook jumped on that as incorrect, since they felt that while India is on the continent of Asia, there seems to be a loud minority that think Asians are only from nations such as China, Japan, South and North Korea, Cambodia, etc., versus India or Pakistan. And so I think that I think this is a really interesting kind of comment in the question, like buried in that. And a lot of that goes back to what Rachel mentioned earlier, which are like the government check boxes, which are wildly inaccurate and inefficient when it comes to like actually thinking about intersections of ethnicity. And so like Kamala Harris's, her mom is Indian, right? And her dad is Black. I can't remember what kind of Black, if he's Island or African American. I should definitely look that up. But the fact that, you know, part Asian American, I don't know why they said that. And then we also don't know how she identifies. So if you're Indian, like what this is saying that Indian people are like this, no, Asian is not India, like that's a different thing. And it really just depends on, I'm not saying no, anyone is wrong because you get to decide, but the way that we in the government, in the country, because of just the chain of command, like define these things, like it's Asia, but it's not Asia. Asian, like when we say, oh, they're Asian, like what do you even mean by that? That's like hundreds of different ethnicities. It's like a total like ball of nothing and everything. And so being specific and get ready to see a lot more about that and probably a lot more around her nationality. But yeah, I didn't really give an answer, but it really, I understand why she was called that, but it's also very, very inaccurate when you think about the intersections of ethnicity and how people from different regions identify, which I would say is more accurate than how the government decided to lump everyone into boxes. Rachel, what do you think about that?
Well, I haven't read up on it, so I don't know the particular case that we're talking about in terms of this the discussion. But I'd say like there's probably a layer of model minority too. So on Code Switch, like a pretty recent episode of that podcast, they do discuss a little bit Asians for Black Lives, for example, and then a lot about the model minority. So which, you know, in the pretty US centric, but in the US context, like how accessible is whiteness or desirable whiteness to certain racial groups, and how it's sometimes more accessible to, for example, East Asians or maybe even Southeast Asians or South Asians. So there could be a layer of like acceptability and whiteness and putting all this weird stuff that we have been brainwashed with in quotes, even though it's very real, to wonder if there's like layers of model minority in that conversation as well. And, you know, like there's layers of all of this when you talk about presidential leadership or any political leadership or business leadership in our country. What is acceptable to the American public around a woman in that position or a Black person in that position, you know, so there's just like layers there that I imagine play into that conversation about not just her own identity, but what people are putting on her and their feelings about that.
Yeah. Do you want to define or talk a little bit more about model minority and kind of your take on what that means? And I'll jump in.
Yeah, I wish I had a slide that defined it well, but the way that we use it in like, and even in family conversations of late, is been to think about the ways that like in US culture, there are certain groups that it's like easiest to explain it around, for example, Asian American business owners or as Asian Americans as students, for example, where there's this idea that there's like positive traits like studiousness or good business acumen or thriftiness or things like that are associated with certain racial groups, as opposed to those traits being absent in other racial groups. Mm-hmm. And so it like lumps these positive and then the contrasting either absence of those or negative traits in other racial groups and elevates like a sort of a racial hierarchy. And of course, most of this stuff is, I mean, it can be very overt, but sometimes it can be very subtle in terms of how we compliment people or laugh about things. Like, for example, I was just having a conversation with a friend about Asian real estate agents, and like all throughout this conversation, even though it was, you know, she's married to a Vietnamese American, and certainly a lot of it is based in actual lived experience, there's this whole layer of like, oh, well, you know how it is sort of built into it. So I don't know if that helps, but it's more of a use case than a definition.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that you explained it really good. And I would just do a little experiment and watch what racial identity the news and different outlets use for Kamala Harris, for Senator Harris, depending upon, especially link it to like positive and negative things. I bet I wouldn't be surprised to see like when they talk about her negatively, they put African American first. When they talk about her positively, they put, Indian first. worse. Like they're going to use her mixed race to further their own agenda around whatever message they're putting out. So just be ready for that and like watch it, like just look for it. And just, I'm sure that, I mean, it's not funny, but we'll get, you know, just some insights into how the media manipulates different stories based on their own self-interest. So just be on the lookout for that for sure, because it's coming like in vast quantities.
It's just part of our the political game in the U.S. and part of the partisanship and all of the layers of our identity as the U.S. is to have these conversations in helpful and mostly unhelpful ways.
Yes. Thank you. In the Q&A, Kamala Harris's dad is Jamaican. That's what I thought, but I didn't want to misspeak. I'm like, I'm pretty sure he's from an island originally, but I wasn't sure. So Jamaican. I will commit that to memory as well. Okay, cool. We have about 7 minutes left. Rachel, do you want to take the last question that came in today that I sent you?
Sure. And I see one from the chat too. From
oh, cool.
From Jessica too. I don't know if you might want to. Maybe you want to take that, and I'll.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know, and then I'll think, and then I can think of the question. Let's see. The last question. I'm not sure.
The one that I emailed to you that came in.
The one that just came in. Okay.
Yep. Okay, cool. So after George Floyd's passing, I've been contacted once by my manager. How do I navigate the conversation with my manager who I don't have a close relationship with? I am dealing with various hardships during a hectic time on top of having to balance my workload. Yeah, that is, well, wait, so did they say that you have once? I mean, this is terrible, but one time, that's amazing. There are so many people who haven't been contacted at all because people are so afraid to bring it up. And unfortunately, like in our country, in corporate America, I'm not sure what industry you're in, but like managers just aren't taught to like connect with people as people. And so what I would do, I don't know how big your team is. I don't know if there's other people who are also feeling the same way, but one thing that you could do is reach out to your manager or reach out to these people who might also want to have this kind of conversation and just say, hey, you know, it's been really tough for me. It's been really tough for some other people on the team as well. And we'd love to like just have a conversation to talk a little bit more about it in the team meeting. And I know that this is putting the work on you, but it sounds like your manager isn't going to do it themselves. But you could also suggest them like, hey, can you help facilitate a conversation so that we can get some of this out? Because, you know, there is no work-life balance, but it's all mixed together. We're literally working in our home spaces and we just need to have a little bit of an outlet. And I know that that's not the ideal flow because we want our managers and our places of work to support us in the conversations as things are happening. But because that's not happening, how can you kind of step into that role? And I always like to think of it because I've had so many bad managers throughout my course of corporate America. And there's been many times where I'm like, the right thing to do right now is XYZ, but I know they're not going to do it. So what if I was the manager? What would I do? And actually like put myself in that role. And then I start doing that thing. And most of the time that turned out really great. I mean, I'm sure my manager didn't appreciate it in some cases as well, but that was more about ego than about outcome. So how can you put yourself forward and do what you would do for both yourself and for the people that are feeling similar to you on your team or in your department or just around you, and try to host a forum and see if you can get some traction on that. See if you can get manager support. If you can't, do it anyways, because it's super important for us to have these spaces, to have these conversations, to be able to get this out. And to get the support that we need, both at you know, in all the places that we are, in all the structures and spaces. So I say, put on your manager hat and do what you think needs to be done. And again, hopefully you'll get support from your manager. If you don't, I say it's worth it. You know, because you're not even just helping yourself, you're helping other people who feel the same way and may not feel as empowered to do so. So that's what I think about it. Rachel, anything to add?
Well, I mean, this is not even just for this particular use case, but in general with organizations, you always kind of have three options. You can submit to whatever the leadership says, you can advocate, or you can exit. And so there's just like, I think that with anything, and that's true with toxic bosses too, or toxic cultures, is like, you always have to remember you've got options, and like different layers of privilege and context and opportunity and finances, all that stuff play into what the decisions actually are. But you always have those three options available to you. And I feel like that, at least in toxic situations I've been in, or unhelpful situations that I've been in, or unhealthy, has helped make it less hard to bear, remembering I have options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, be the boss that you wish you had, because you're practicing for when you get to be a leader, and how you'll
We'll
treat
look
your
forward to that. Yeah, for
boss.
all the.
Exactly. Exactly.
So
Okay.
we have 3 minutes, but I think the one you mentioned, Carrie, was kind of about distancing and possibly
Yeah.
connecting it a little bit to cancel culture. Yeah.
I found it on my desk. Want me to read it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So this is a great question that came in at the buzzer earlier today. So my friend comes from a very conservative background who is not supportive of Black Lives Matter movement. Because of this, she isn't vocal about her support for the movement and chooses not to participate in conversations about the topic whenever me and my other friends bring it up. It makes me feel like she doesn't care enough about Black lives, and it's causing me to not to want to be her friend anymore. Is it wrong of me to distance myself from her? That is a deep question. What do you think?
Well, so I think that some of it, like, another question that we didn't get to talk about was about cancel culture. So this kind of idea that like we don't agree with somebody, so we cancel them, or like cancel them, or like so like that's like a normal. It's a super normal and probably helpful urge to say like this person is like their worldview is so in conflict with mine. Like I need to limit my time with them. And so I think like distance. So it's sort of hard because on one hand, like I believe pretty deeply in like intergenerational conversations, as well as like conversations with people who have very different worldviews than I have. And so it's like, I wouldn't want to cut that out of my life, but like having healthy boundaries with somebody that's just like has a worldview that's so incompatible with yours, particularly if they're in a place of power or that they could like try to influence or manipulate you, like, yeah, that sounds just like healthy boundaries. So it's like, yes, maybe commit to like having hard conversations with people you don't agree with, but this particular person, whatever the context is, figure out what's the healthy boundary. And then like, like Carrie keeps reiterating, like we're going to be in different places in our lives. And so sometimes you'll be in a healthier place, or even just like, not even health, just like a position of more space, mental capacity to have those conversations, or more like energy. And so you might be able to revisit conversations, but it's okay to have people ebb and flow in terms of how much of your time you're giving them. And then certainly on social media, I think that muting things is okay, especially if it's going to be constantly triggering or like reopening wounds, so like I think that's okay.
Yeah, definitely you're like, hide you. I can't. Absolutely.
Hi, not, yeah, maybe not.
Yeah.
Hi, there we go.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that this particular one, because this is your friend, it just makes me feel like a difficult, brave, courageous conversation is like potentially in your future, right? Because before you stopped hanging around her, you probably would want to understand a little bit more about why. Like, why doesn't she specifically want to talk about it, and let her know like what that means to you? I'm assuming that this person is a person of color, because this like disconnect between you don't believe in this, but I'm this, right? And so does that mean you like support me, right? So having that conversation, frankly, because it's important, that person likely doesn't even realize what their actions are communicating outward. Like when you don't support Black lives, I'm Black, you aren't supporting me, and I want to understand like why and how that works for you, right? And again, we talked about how you set yourself up for success in this conversation. Create a safe space, like let them know that you care about them, that you want to understand, that you're not trying to argue, like just that, think about like the goal of your conversation, which is really your friendship, right? You want to maintain your friendship. And so being really open, honest, vulnerable, and then just having the conversation, asking them, and they might be unwilling, or they might be willing. You might learn that their aloofness or apparent apathy is something else, or it could be exactly what you thought, and you can give them a chance to explain / give them yourself a chance to like kind of marry how you're thinking about it, how you're interpreting it, and then just like work through it. And that could end up in you don't hang out with that person anymore, or it could work out in like we understand each other better, or we agree to disagree, whatever. We don't know how that's going to end out. I would love to, if you want to send us an email that shares kind of how that ended up. I'd love to hear what you decided to do and what that looked like. So yeah. All right. Well, Rachel, any last words? We are at 5:02, and so we are gonna close it out. Any last words? Any parting thoughts?
Oh, well, just gratitude for showing up, having conversations, and grace for us that, when we're talking just for ourselves. And I don't know. I just hope every time we have these conversations, I guess I just hope it renews our commitment to the lifelong work, and helps us align what we say with what we do.
Absolutely. Rachel, thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with me. Thank you everyone for giving your questions, for being in the chat, for sending us up in the Q&A. We are trying to collect those 500 questions. So when you see our posts, please share them. Please encourage people to submit questions. And then as you continue to think about these topics we've talked about today and other things, keep sending those questions in because the more questions helps us create better answers, which will eventually lead to resources all to support allies on their journey. So we appreciate you so much for being here, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Carrie.
Bye. Thanks, Rachel. Bye, everyone.